In the winter of 1941, somewhere west of Moscow, a German tank commander leaned out of his hatch and stared at a shape moving through the snow. It did not look like the tanks he had trained to fight. It was low, wide. Its armor sloped like a roof, shedding rain instead of snow. The tracks were so broad they barely seemed to sink into the frozen mud beneath them. When it fired, the sound did not crack. It punched. For 10 seconds, maybe less, he understood something that would take entire factories years to fully explain. This war was no longer just about tactics. It was about production. The vehicle in front of him was a T-34. Not a miracle, not a myth. A machine built from steel, numbers, and decisions made far from the front lines, in offices, rail yards, and assembly halls that stretched across the Soviet Union. Its story did not begin with a battlefield. It began with a problem written on a map. In the late 1930s, Soviet planners looked west and saw distance as both a shield and a weakness. The Red Army needed a tank that could cross that distance, survive bad roads, deep snow, summer dust, and still fight at the end of it. Existing designs were either too slow, too fragile, or too complex to build in the tens of thousands they believed a modern war would demand. So they simplified. They took lessons from earlier fast tanks, from foreign designs, from their own disastrous experiments, and pushed them into a single shape. Sloped armor instead of thick slabs. A diesel engine instead of gasoline, not for elegance, but because it burned less easily and could run on fuel the Soviet economy could actually provide. Wide tracks, not for style, but because Russia was not Germany. It was mud, ice, and broken ground for half the year. When the first T-34s rolled out of the Kharkov locomotive factory in 1940, they were not perfect. Crews complained about cramped turrets, poor optics, and transmissions that fought back like stubborn animals. But the designers were not chasing perfection. They were chasing something else. They were chasing a tank that factories could keep building even while moving. By the summer of 1941, those factories were no longer safe. Operation Barbarossa had pushed deep into Soviet territory, and the front line was racing east faster than blueprints could be revised. Entire plants were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and sent beyond the Ural Mountains. Machines, workers, and half-finished hulls traveled thousands of kilometers through cold and chaos, reassembled in fields and empty sheds. Production did not stop. It bent. In those makeshift halls, the T-34 became less a design and more a system. Welding seams grew rougher. Cast parts replaced machined ones. Anything that saved minutes on the line was kept. Anything that slowed the flow was cut away. The result was not prettier. It was faster. By 1942, German intelligence reports began to change their tone. Early on, they described the T-34 as a technical surprise. Later, they described it as a numerical one. Where one appeared, another followed. Then another. Not because each was superior, but because there were always more coming. This was the war of factories. And the T-34 was not winning it alone. It was a product of rail networks that survived bombing, of workers who slept beside their machines, of steel mills that poured day and night, of planners who counted tanks the way others counted battalions. On the battlefield, crews learned its limits the hard way. Its gun could punch through early German armor, but struggled against newer designs. Its optics lagged behind Western standards. Communication inside the tank was often done by kicks and shouts instead of radios. But when one burned, another took its place. By the time of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long push westward, the T-34 had become something larger than itself. It had become a symbol of a system that could absorb losses and still move forward. A machine shaped as much by logistics tables and production quotas as by engineers' drawings. The German commander who first saw it in the snow would later write that it felt like fighting the ground itself, not because the tank was unstoppable, but because it never seemed to run out. Sources for this story draw from publicly available historical records, including Soviet production data archived by the Russian State Archive of the Economy, wartime intelligence summaries captured and published by the U.S. National Archives, and post-war analyses such as Stephen Zaloga's T-34 8-5 versus M26 Pershing and David Glantz's studies on the Eastern Front. The numbers, movements, and production trends are not legend. They are written in shipping logs, factory reports, and after-action reviews that still exist on paper and microfilm. And in those pages, the T-34 is not described as a hero. It is described as a process. In the factories beyond the Urals, time was measured in shifts, not days. Workers arrived before dawn and left after dark, their breath turning to frost in the air that leaked through unfinished walls. Many had never built tanks before the war. They had been farmers, students, clerks. Now they learned to weld armor plates that weighed more than their entire families. Training manuals were thin. Experience was learned by burning hands and crooked seams. The T-34 became their teacher. Early models were inconsistent. One tank might run smoothly for weeks. The next might lose a gear before it ever reached the front. Engineers kept notebooks filled with small changes. A bolt that could be moved to save 10 seconds. A casting mold that could be reused instead of remade. A hatch design that wasted steel. None of it made headlines. All of it added up. By 1942, the Soviet Union was producing more tanks than Germany, even as its territory remained under threat. This was not because their machines were more advanced. It was because their system was simpler, fewer parts, less precision where it did not matter. Tolerances wide enough that a hammer could fix what a micrometer once controlled, German engineers noticed. Reports from the front filtered back to Berlin, then to design offices in Kassel and Nuremberg. The T-34 sloped armor became a case study. Its wide tracks appeared in sketches. Its diesel engine raised questions about fuel strategy. But changing a design in peacetime is one thing. Changing an entire industrial culture in the middle of a war is something else. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, the two systems met in full view. Thousands of tanks faced each other across minefields and trenches. On one side, German formations built around fewer, heavier, more complex machines. On the other, waves of T-34C, lighter, rougher, and easier to replace. The battlefield did not choose a winner in a single day. But the factories did. Soviet records show that even as losses mounted, output continued to climb. Assembly lines ran on simplified schedules. New models, like the T-34, 8-5, with its larger turret and improved gun, were introduced without stopping production. Old hulls and new turrets met on the same rails. For the crews, the tank was both home and hazard. Inside, the air filled with smoke and heat. The engine roared so loudly that commands were passed by touch. Armor that could deflect a shell at one angle could be pierced at another. Survival depended on speed, positioning, and luck. Yet many returned to the same machine after repairs. The same welded scars, the same dented fenders. The tank became familiar in a war where almost nothing else was. Across the lines, German units began to speak of numbers more than models. Not a T-34, but dozens of tanks. Not a single threat, but a tide. By 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, rail yards followed behind them. Mobile repair shops set up near the front. Damaged tanks were hauled back, patched, and sent forward again. The cycle of steel and movement never fully stopped. This was not elegance. It was momentum. Publicly available documents from the Soviet People's Commissariat for Tank Industry, now held in Russian and international archives, show production figures climbing past 50,000 T-34s by the end of the war. German wartime assessments, preserved and captured records at the U.S. National Archives, increasingly framed the tank not as a single weapon, but as an expression of industrial capacity. On paper, it was a vehicle. In practice, it was a line that ran from a steel mill to a battlefield and then back again. As the front moved west, the geography of the war changed, but the rhythm of production did not. In Poland, in Ukraine, in the ruins of cities that had been fought over twice, the Red Army found rail lines twisted and bridges collapsed. Engineers followed behind the tanks, not to celebrate victory, but to rebuild the paths that fed it. A repaired track meant another train. Another train meant another tank. The map of the war was slowly overlaid with a second map, drawn in schedules and timetables. The T-34 rolled across both. In the spring of 1944, crews began to notice subtle differences between older machines and the ones arriving from the factories. The new turret on the T-34-85 gave commanders more space. The larger gun could reach farther, strike harder. Radios became more common. Coordination improved. The tank was still rough. The welds were still uneven. The paint was still thin. But the system behind it had learned. This learning did not come from theory. It came from loss. Soviet after-action reports, now available in translated form through military archives and academic publications, read less like strategy and more like accounting. How many tanks reached the line? How many were disabled? How many were repaired? How many crews returned? Each number became a pressure point for the next change on the factory floor. German units, by contrast, struggled with a different kind of math. Their tanks often outmatched the T-34 in a direct duel, thicker armor, more precise optics, more powerful guns. But each machine required more time, more skilled labor, and more resources that were increasingly scarce. Fuel shortages grounded formations. Spare parts became rare. A damaged vehicle could sit for weeks waiting for a component that no longer arrived. On the battlefield, this imbalance showed itself quietly. A village would be taken in the morning and contested by evening. The next day, Soviet tanks would return in greater numbers. The German response would be careful, measured, and limited. Not by tactics, but by availability. The T-34's presence became predictable in one way and unpredictable in another. Crews knew they would see it. They did not know from where or how many. For the men inside the tank, the war of factories felt distant. They felt the cold through the metal floor. They felt the jolt when a shell struck the hull. They felt the weight of the hatch when it closed above them. The grand system reduced itself to a narrow field of view through a periscope and a few meters of ground ahead. Yet behind that narrow view stood an entire economy. Post-war studies, including those published by the Soviet General Staff and later analyzed by Western historians like David Glantz and John Erickson, would frame the Eastern Front as a contest of endurance, not just of armies, but of industries. The T-34 became the most visible shape of that endurance, simply because it was the one that kept moving. By the time Soviet forces crossed into Germany in 1945, many of the tanks at the front were a mix of old and new. Hulls built in 1942 carried turrets cast in 1944. Engines had been swapped, tracks replaced. The machine was no longer a single moment in production. It was a timeline on steel. The war of factories had reached its last chapter, and the T-34 was still there. When the fighting finally slowed, the T-34 did not disappear. In the summer of 1945, rows of them stood in fields and depots across Eastern Europe, paint faded, numbers chalked on their hulls. Some had crossed half a continent. Others had never fired a shot. All of them carried the marks of a system that had learned to build faster than it could bury. For Soviet planners, the end of the war did not mean the end of production. The same factories that had poured armor under bombardment now turned to rebuilding armies, borders, and influence. The T-34 became a tool of presence. It rolled in parades in Moscow. It appeared in the inventories of new governments across Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The war of factories had changed shape. Western military observers, reading captured documents and touring former production sites, noted something that went beyond the machine itself. The T-34 was not just a design that worked. It was a design that could be taught. Blueprints were shared. Licenses were granted. Entire production lines were exported. Countries without a long tradition of heavy industry learned to build tanks by copying the same rough methods the Soviets had used under pressure. The result was a second life for the vehicle. In Korea, in the early 1950s, American and United Nations forces would again meet the silhouette of the T-34 on the battlefield. The tank was no longer new. Its opponents were different. Its context had shifted. But the underlying idea remained the same. A machine that could be produced in large numbers, repaired in the field, and operated by crews trained in weeks instead of years. Historians later argued about whether the T-34 was the best tank of the war. The debate filled journals and conferences. Armor thickness, gun performance, crew ergonomics, reliability. Each category told a different story, but production numbers told a simpler one. Archival data from the Russian State Archive of the Economy and wartime summaries preserved by Allied intelligence placed total T-34 production at over 50,000 units by 1945. No other medium tank of the war came close. That figure did not measure quality, it measured capacity. For the men who had built them, the tank was a memory of cold floors, long shifts, and a war fought with gloves on and sparks in the air. For the crews who had driven them, it was the smell of diesel, the rattle of tracks, and the moment when the engine caught after a night in the snow. For the planners who had counted them, it was a column on a ledger that had to stay ahead of another column, no matter the cost. In museums today, the T-34 sits under lights and behind ropes. Visitors walk around it, read plaques, take photographs. The armor looks solid. The shape looks deliberate. It feels finished. But its story was never really about the machine. It was about the line behind it. A line that ran from mines to mills, from mills to factories, from factories to rail yards, and from rail yards to the front. A line that did not care about heroism or fear, only about flow. In that sense, the T-34 was not built for a single battle, or even a single war. It was built for a world where wars were decided by how fast a society could turn effort into steel, and steel into motion. After the last trains rolled back to their peacetime schedules, the records remained. Ledgers filled with serial numbers, tonnage figures, and monthly outputs sat in archives, quietly telling the second half of the T-34's story. Not the one told in memoirs or films, but the one told in ink and stamps. How many tons of steel arrived in January? How many engines failed inspection in March? How many hulls were accepted, rejected, or sent back down the line? These pages revealed something simple and unsettling. The tank did not exist as a single object. It existed as a rate. Western analysts who gained access to captured German and Soviet material in the late 1940s and 1950s began to use a new language. They spoke less about battlefield performance and more about replacement cycles and industrial throughput. The T-34 became a case study in how a weapon system could be shaped to match the limits and strengths of a national economy. The lesson was not lost. In the decades that followed, armies around the world adjusted their thinking. Complexity was weighed against manufacturability. Precision was balanced against training time. The shadow of the Eastern Front fell across design offices in places that had never seen a T-34 in person. For the veterans who lived long enough to revisit the war in their old age, the memory often returned in fragments. The sound of a starter motor in the cold, the feel of frozen metal through gloves, the way the ground shook when a column began to move. The tank, in their stories, was rarely described as a triumph. It was described as a companion, sometimes reliable, sometimes cruel, always present. Public interviews preserved by oral history projects in Russia, Germany, and the United States reflect this divide. Engineers spoke in measurements. Commanders spoke in maps. Crews spoke in moments. And through all of them, the same shape passed. The sloped armor, the wide tracks, the blunt, practical silhouette that had first appeared in the snow in 1941 and then never quite left the world stage. In the end, the T-34's legacy was not sealed by a single battle or a single decision. It was sealed by repetition, by the simple act of being built again, and again, and again. In small towns that never appeared on wartime maps, the war arrived anyway. It came in the form of recruitment posters for factory work, in trains that carried teenagers instead of soldiers, in ration cards that counted calories with the same seriousness others counted shells. The T-34's story, when traced backward far enough, led not to a drafting table, but to kitchens, dormitories, and long queues outside supply offices. Soviet wartime directives, now available through declassified collections and academic archives, reveal how production targets were broken down into human units. Not tanks per month, but workers per shift, hours per task, days per delivery. The language of industry became the language of daily life. A missing bolt in a tank began as a missing shipment in a rail yard. A delayed shipment began as a broken machine in a mill. A broken machine began as a worker who had not slept. The chain was long and fragile, yet it held. Part of that resilience came from a kind of brutal honesty in the design. The T-34 was not built to hide its flaws. It was built to survive them. If a casting was imperfect, it was often accepted anyway. If a weld was uneven, it was reinforced instead of redone. The goal was not to reach a standard of beauty, but a standard of function. German technical teams that examined captured T-34Cs during the war noted this in their reports. They described rough internal finishes, inconsistent component quality, and tolerances that would have failed their own inspection regimes. And yet, they also noted how many of these tanks still ran, still fired, still moved. The contrast was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. Where one system aimed for precision first and volume second, the other reversed the order. The battlefield became the place where those choices were tested, not debated. By late 1944, as Soviet forces pushed deeper into Central Europe, the industrial distance behind them shortened. Rail lines grew more secure. Repair facilities became more permanent. The cycle from damage to return to service tightened. Tanks that might once have been written off were now back in line within days. For the crews, this meant something simple. Familiarity. They learned the sounds of their engines the way sailors learn the sounds of their ships. A rattle that meant a loose track. A cough that meant bad fuel. A silence that meant something worse. The T-34 became less a machine to be mastered and more a space to be inhabited. Post-war memoirs, preserved in published collections and university archives, often return to this intimacy. Veterans wrote about carving names into the inside of turrets, about hanging small icons or photographs near the radio, about treating the tank as a kind of moving shelter in a landscape that offered none. None of this appears in production tables. None of it shows up in tonnage charts. But it lived inside the same steel that those charts counted. When the war receded into textbooks and anniversaries, the T-34 remained in service. In training grounds across the Soviet Union and its allies, young crews learned to drive, load, and fire in machines that were already older than they were. Paint was reapplied. Engines were rebuilt. The tank became a classroom as much as a weapon. Manuals written in the late 1940s and early 1950s, now preserved in military libraries and digitized collections, show how the vehicle was used to teach not just gunnery and movement, but coordination, maintenance, and discipline. The war of factories had turned into a war of habits. Military planners in other countries took note. Reports produced by Western defense institutions during the early Cold War period, many now declassified, treated the T-34 as a benchmark. Not for its firepower alone, but for what it represented. A system that could be mobilized quickly, scaled broadly, and sustained under pressure. This attention did not come from admiration. It came from calculation. In strategic studies, the tank appeared in charts and projections. How many could be fielded in a year? How many rail cars would be required to move them? How much fuel they would consume over a campaign? The language of war had become almost entirely numerical. Yet the numbers always led back to people. In interviews conducted decades later, archived by historical institutes and oral history projects, former factory workers spoke about the moment the war ended. They described stepping out of the plants into quiet streets, the sudden absence of shift whistles, the strange feeling of no longer being needed at the same pace. Some returned to farms. Some stayed in industry. The tank that had defined their days became a memory. For museum visitors, the T-34 often appears as a symbol of victory or sacrifice. The plaques summarize its role in a few sentences: dates, battles, production totals, a clean line through a complicated past. But the archives tell a longer story. They show correspondence between ministries and plants arguing over steel allocations. They show train schedules revised because a bridge had been bombed. They show inspection reports filled with red ink and stamps. The machine is present in all of it, not as an object, but as a demand. By the middle of the 20th century, the idea behind the T-34 had spread beyond tanks. Aircraft, ships, even civilian infrastructure projects began to be discussed in similar terms. How fast could it be built? How easily could it be repaired? How many could be made if everything went wrong? The war of factories had left its mark on how the world thought about preparation itself. And in that sense, the T-34 did not really retire. It simply changed the shape of the questions people asked. As years passed, the T-34 began to appear in places far from any battlefield. It stood on concrete pedestals in town squares. It rolled slowly through anniversary parades. Its silhouette was cast in bronze, painted on murals, printed in school books. The tank that had once been counted in columns of production data became a symbol that could be carried in a sentence. But symbols simplify. Archives do not. Researchers who opened boxes in Moscow, Berlin, and Washington in the 1970s and 1980s found a more complicated picture. They found reports that praised output in one month and warned of shortages the next. They found letters from factory directors asking for more coal, more hands, more time. They found field reports that spoke of victories and, in the same breath, of engines that froze and guns that jammed. The T-34's reputation grew smoother than the metal it was made from. Academic studies, drawing on declassified material from both sides of the former front, began to place the tank back into its industrial context. They showed how the relocation of Soviet factories eastward created new cities almost overnight. How rail networks became as strategic as any river crossing. How the success of a tank unit could hinge on whether a train arrived on time. In this telling, the hero was not a machine. It was coordination. For the generation that grew up after the war, the T-34 was often encountered first in photographs. Black and white images of columns moving through snow, of crews sitting on turrets, of wrecks half buried in mud. The stillness of those images hid the motion that had defined the tank's real life. The constant movement from raw material to finished hull, from finished hull to front line, from front line back to repair. Motion was its natural state. In economic histories published in the late 20th century, the tank began to appear in chapters about planning and mobilization. It was used to illustrate how a state could redirect an entire economy toward a single purpose: steel quotas, labor assignments, transport priorities. The T-34 became a reference point, a shorthand for what mass production under pressure looked like. Yet for those who had lived inside the process, the memory remained grounded in small things. The taste of soup in a factory canteen, the feel of oil on hands that would not quite come clean, the sound of a radio crackling with news from the front while a welding torch flared in the background. These details rarely make it into textbooks, but they are there in diaries and letters, preserved in family collections and regional archives, waiting for someone patient enough to read past the headlines. The T-34, in those pages, is less a monument and more a presence. A reason people moved, a reason they waited, a reason they endured. In the quiet rooms of historians, long after the engines fell silent, the T-34 became a question more than an answer. Seminars and articles debated its place in the larger pattern of the war. Was it the machine that changed tactics or the system that changed outcomes? Charts compared it to Shermans and Panthers, to production lines in Detroit and assembly halls in Kassel. The numbers were laid side by side, and still they did not fully explain why one silhouette came to define an entire front. What did emerge, again and again, was scale. Scale of territory. Scale of industry. Scale of human effort. The Eastern Front stretched across forests, rivers, cities, and plains that swallowed armies whole. To move anything across it required not just vehicles, but organization that could survive disruption. The T-34 fit into that reality not because it was perfect, but because it could be imperfect and still be useful. In post-war economic studies, the tank was used as an example of robust design, a concept that favored systems able to function under stress, even when conditions fell far below ideal. The T-34's wide tracks, its diesel engine, its simplified components were framed not as innovations in isolation, but as responses to an environment that punished delicacy. This way of thinking began to appear far from military circles. Civil engineers cited similar principles in infrastructure planning. Economists wrote about redundancy and flow. The language of production lines, once tied to wartime urgency, seeped into discussions about highways, power grids, and factories that made nothing more dangerous than refrigerators. The War of Factories had taught a lesson that did not stay on the battlefield. For the last surviving veterans, interviewed in the early 21st century by documentary projects and national archives, the T-34 often surfaced in memories without grand conclusions. They spoke about learning to drive it in a muddy field, about the way the hatch slammed shut, about the moment they realized they were no longer afraid of the noise. One former loader described counting shells not because Manuel told him to, but because the rhythm calmed him. Another spoke about naming the tank, not out of superstition, but because it felt easier to talk to something that had a name. These stories do not appear in production totals. They appear in margins. As the T-34's physical presence faded from active service and moved almost entirely into museums and monuments, its conceptual presence remained. It lingered in how planners thought about preparedness, in how designers balanced complexity against reliability, in how societies imagined what it meant to be ready for something they hoped would never come. In that sense, the tank's final role was not on a battlefield or a parade ground. It was in a meeting room, on a blueprint, in a budget line. A quiet reminder that behind every piece of technology stands a chain of people, places, and choices that determine whether it exists at all. In the archives, there are moments where the story seems to pause. A memo stamped but never answered. A production chart that stops mid-month. A shipment log with the destination crossed out and replaced by another in hurried handwriting. These gaps do not announce themselves. They sit quietly, waiting for someone to notice that something did not go as planned. For the T-34, these pauses often mark the places where reality pushed back against design. Steel shipments delayed by storms, coal shortages that slowed furnaces, rail congestion that left finished tanks standing in rows, engines cold, waiting for space on a flat car. The system that seemed so relentless from a distance was, up close, a constant negotiation with limits. Soviet planners wrote about rhythm in their internal correspondence. The word appears in documents preserved in state and regional archives. Rhythm of supply. Rhythm of labor. Rhythm of output. The idea was simple. If the rhythm broke, the line broke. And if the line broke, the front would feel it weeks later. This delay, this distance between cause and effect, became one of the defining features of the War of Factories. A decision made in an office in the Urals might not be felt on the battlefield in Ukraine until a month had passed. A bridge destroyed by a bomber might reduce tank numbers at the front long after the smoke had cleared. The T-34 moved inside this invisible timeline. For German commanders, the appearance of new tanks often felt sudden, almost inexplicable. But behind each arrival stood a sequence of events that began far away, in places they would never see. The war, in this sense, was being fought in two dimensions at once. The visible one of maps and maneuvers, and the hidden one of schedules and shipments. Post-war analyses, especially those drawing on both Soviet and German records, began to map these timelines. They traced how production surges aligned with offensives, how shortages coincided with pauses at the front. The tank became a marker, a way to read the pulse of an entire economy. Yet for the individuals inside the machine, none of this was visible. They knew only what lay ahead of the tracks, the ground, the road, the next village, the next ridge. The War of Factories remained behind them, humming quietly in places they would never visit, shaping their future one delivery at a time. In the end, the T-34 does not rest in a single place. It rests in archives where production numbers still line up in careful columns. It rests in museums where its steel has cooled into history. It rests in the memories of those who built it, drove it, repaired it, and counted it. The tank itself was never the point. The point was the system that stood behind it. A system that turned coal into steel, steel into machines, and machines into momentum. A system that learned, adapted, simplified, and kept moving even when the world around it broke apart. On the Eastern Front, battles were visible. Factories were not. But one could not exist without the other. The T-34 crossed fields, cities, and borders. But its longer journey ran through rail lines, assembly halls, and the hands of people who would never see the front, yet shaped it all the same. When historians look back, they do not see just a tank. They see a society under pressure, choosing what to value, what to sacrifice, and what to keep moving at all costs. And in that sense, the T-34 was not built for a single war. It was built for a world where the outcome is decided long before the first engine starts.